Hey there, YouTube family. Welcome back to this underwater seascape. I hope you had a wonderful time with part 1. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, I will link it in the video description. But with that said, let's have some fun. Let's continue and just make our painting as good as we possibly can. So I won't ramble anymore, and let's get into it. So now we can add some reflective light in here, we can add some rays of light, we are at that point, but I think I'd like to cover the majority of the canvas first with paint before we get into that detail, just so I know how much I want to incorporate. So, I'm going to take the same medium-sized flat-headed brush that we've been using, and I'm going to work in this rock right here. Now, it's fairly close to us. The back of it will be quite dark, and it'll share a similar effect as this. So this side will be more light, this side will be more dark. I'm going to begin here with the darker side, just because it's going to help me define my space and know how much detail I want to incorporate. So I'm going to begin by working on the top here. I'm going to start working down. And then I think I'm just going to give it this extra little shape that I didn't initially draw in there, but it'll make it much more interesting. Then I'll start to fill it in, painting around my seaweed and my red coral. There we go. We've been painting for quite some time now, and so I feel like things are really warmed up. When we go and we apply paint, we do so with purpose, and it happens much more quickly. Now this is all fairly wet, so I'm just going to do a secondary layer, get a little bit more titanium white, Mars black, and just like this, it is taken care of. Now I am going to move this over into the other side, as you can see, and up around my starfish here. Also make the bottom a little bit darker, because less light will be able to get to that area. Now we need a lighter value. So take a lot of titanium white, just kind of place this over here in my mid-grays, allow it to naturally make it a little bit less bright. I do want it to be fairly bright though, I want it to be a little bit brighter than the arch. And then I will work systematically, carefully around my starfish with the corner of the brush, retaining that initial drawing, working around the seaweed, and then I will blend it down into the darker pigment that we have, just like so. Now we'll have a light value, a medium value, and a dark value, and with that, some depth. Going to take a little bit more of that highlight, wrap it around the back edge here, as it'll get a little bit of reflected light working around it. The bottom will remain quite dark, as will the true back of it. Right here. There we go. Then I'm going to switch to the smallest flat-headed brush to incorporate some extra detailed highlights along the top. There we are. Brighten it up just a little bit more. Like so. As you can see, it quickly grays as it moves in contact with the rest of the rock. But that really isn't a bad thing. We don't want all of it to be extremely bright. Now we'll paint on our starfish. Start with a bit of a darker layer to begin with. Done one already. Should be practiced. I like to make my starfish quite wide, though I know
They can also look really nice when they are tapered. So I'll let you decide how you want to do them, or maybe you want to do a variety of them. It's also a good option. Now I'm heading in. I'll add some highlight. Now you need to be careful with the highlight here though, because they are on such a light area of rock. So I'm not going to make them as bright as that rock, and I'm going to allow the edges to remain a little bit darker as the top part protrudes, right? It sticks out. And then as you get down towards the edges, it kind of goes darker as there's more shadow, more subject blocking it. There we go. Add a little bit more highlight to the top of this one because it isn't actually going to be touching the light rock. This is working out very well. And it was quite quick, which is nice. Especially at this point in the painting. We're probably 2.5 hours in. So, going to switch now to the medium-sized flat-headed brush, take a couple of steps back, and I think I'm going to brighten the LCD screen of the camera because it's getting a little dark. So, we are back. I have my medium-sized flat-headed brush, and we can continue in here. The next step is more red coral, and I definitely prefer to paint that with the darker base layer first. So again, a lot of Mars black, a little bit of our titanium white. Just work that in there, use the corner to create those very sharp, nice details. There's another one right here, which will get lost in the rest of the rock, but that's okay. We can just paint it in after with highlight. Here's another one. And then I have all of this space here that's kind of undefined, and I think I want to just kind of extend those out to there. I think it'll be a nice effect. So I'll just do a little one there. Have it come out again, another little one. We'll have some larger ones in here, so it'll all balance out. Suppose we can also do another like this. There we go. A good selection. It kind of rounds it out. Now we add our highlights, our titanium white. Come in on the top and both edges. This one will only put it on the right side because this rock will cast a big shadow on it and it won't be able to stand out in that same way. There we go. Get more highlight. Tap it to the side, tap it to the top, tap it to the side, tap it to the top, to the side, to the top. I'm kind of using the side of my brush and then the corner for this, just going back and forth. Seems to be a very efficient process of getting a lot done relatively quickly. There we go. I'm going to head back in, blend a little bit of this out, that way it isn't too stark and we have a middle value. Same here, same here. Add a little bit to the side. This is a bit farther away from the rock, it won't be getting that same level of shadow. I can do that to these as well. I don't know that we've painted a piece this detailed before on the channel. It's kind of exciting. It's one of those ones you work on and then you can't wait to release it. Kind of in the same way when you're working on a painting and can't wait to show a friend, a family member, maybe take it into a painting class. There we go. And now we need to just lighten this one a little bit more. Trying to avoid using a pure titanium white for any of this. Same with the pure Mars black. Always trying to dilute them a little bit. And then I will add the tops in here. There we go. Now, while I'm having a absolutely great time, the sun is going down. We've been painting for quite some time, so I think I'm going to jump right back at this tomorrow. Until then, I'm going to clean my brushes, clean my water, clean my palette. Though, for you, you don't have to wait. The again, power of editing will make sure that you are right back in the lesson in 3, 2, 1. So we are back. It's actually been a couple of days, but the canvas is just as ready as it would have been in a 5 to 10 minute break. So let's get back to this. Here I have my water, I have my titanium white, my Mars black, and I'm going to take my medium-sized flat-headed brush. Again, this one is 1 centimeter wide. I'm going to make sure that the tip is nice and wet. Then we'll head over and we'll create a highlight for the edge of this rocky area right here. So I'll take some of this titanium white, take a hint with the corner of my brush with some Mars black, and we'll mix this up into a medium to bright gray. Then I'll head over to the side of these rocks, and I'm not going to make it perfectly straight. I'm giving it lots of character, giving it these impressions, moving it out here and there. There you go. And once we have the edge, as you know, we just kind of move in a little bit. Now this is a little bit watery, and you can tell right here it's semi-transparent, so I'm just going to wipe off some of that excess paint, and I'll mix up more of that pigment, because the more pigment we mix, the more pigment there is to mix with the damp water that is on our brush, and therefore this is just an easy way to thicken it. Now we'll continue. Here in the foreground, I have this rock kind of moving here. It's closer to us than this one, which is why I have that extended line right there. And now we will proceed. There we go. Just working in and around my seaweed, being nice and sharp, and there we'll bring it to the forefront. I'm going to go back over a couple of these areas as well, just because they were a little bit watery, and you know what, we have the extra paint, we might as well. There we go. So now that we have the edge done, let's make it a little bit darker and start moving in. So I'll take some extra Mars black, just put that into our initial mixture, and I'm going to start here at the bottom just because it's physically closer to me. And it's been, again, a little while. I took a couple days off. So I want to start with some easier areas just to kind of warm myself up in the painting process. Here yet again, doing a soft blend into that edge, just very light strokes there. Not much pressure at all. That said, if you get some brush strokes in this, it really isn't a bad thing because we are painting rock, which is harder. It does have these sharp edges and pieces to it. There we go. So far, so good. Mix in some darker pigment. Yet again. And we just keep working our way down, as you can see. Again, in between the seaweed, up into the rock. We'll probably have to go back in and make this a little bit darker because it's currently blending with the slightly lighter grays that we have atop, and they are making it a little bit more bright than we want the edge to be. Remember, we're working towards that slight vignette effect with a couple of these edges and corners. Okay, now we'll move over here. I'll just get the edge of the canvas, blend up into there, and avoid my seaweed, of course. You can see how well the sharp edge of this brush is coming in handy, just making it so easy. I'm going to take a step back, just make sure that I have the values fairly in check. So far, so good. Get a little bit more paint. Make sure that it's nice and thick in these areas. I can tell it's a little bit thin, and that's easy to fix. All it takes is a little bit of extra time. Remember, if you get a couple of strokes in there, that's okay. There we go. Building up those shadows. Make it a little bit darker, probably for the last time. And we'll fill that in. I'm reshaping my seaweed just a little bit as I progress. And that's okay. Just figure out the way you want it and then make it so. Don't worry about having to recover things or if it was drawn initially. We learn about our painting as we paint it. And so it's good to make little adjustments as we go, as we get more information. So we figure out what we like as we test things. And just like that, we have the backing of our rock. Now again, I am going to stand up and just make sure that the values are essentially what I want. I can actually see that they're not perfect right there, so I don't need to stand up just yet. I can kind of play with them right here. I just want a little bit more of a blend in this area, both in the darker and in the lighter pieces. There we go. Much better. Okay, so now I'm going to stand up, take a couple of steps back, and then probably move on to the seaweed, provided the values of the new rock work well with the rest of the piece. Now, taking a couple of steps back, I realized just how smooth I made these edges. They all kind of act as these slants, which is really nice. It creates all this movement into the painting this way, where these are, again, fairly similar and they move in this way. However, these have much more divots, where this is quite soft. That is simplification to the point of really extracting what makes it real and interesting. So what we want to do is we want to take a bit of our highlight and we want to just re-interject some additional little protruding pieces and harder edges. So here, this kind of moves up instead of does that glide. I'll create another little piece that kind of sticks out right there. I'll create one down here that kind of connects upwards and then it can be dragged back down. And I'll blend that once I have a little bit less paint on my brush. But here I'm just trying to diversify this significantly more than what we had. I'll make that a little more straight, and then you know what? We can put a little bit of a falling moss like this, kind of overhanging. So I'm just doing a bit of a tap, and that'll make it more interesting as we'll get to play with color a little bit. Now to go back in and blend those new pieces that I added, I'm just going to take that extra paint, water off my brush, grab a little bit of our darker pigment,
and I'll just work that in. As you can see, we now have more form and structure, which is exactly what we want. Now, I'm fairly confident with that. I think from here, we can begin working on more of our seaweed. And if you look at this seaweed, it's more of a medium gray, that way it stands out against all of this light gray. Over here, we have a lot of darker gray, so I think I'm actually going to make this with a bit of a lighter gray to begin with. So take some titanium white, move that into our gray. I'm going to start at the top because that's the finest area, the most sharp point. And when I, of course, go and get new water and paint, I'm going to have an opportunity to create the sharpest applications. So I'm starting up here, I'm starting on the edges. Now I'll move in. Of course, continue down here. Starting on the edges. Recognize that the paint around this might still be wet a little bit, and therefore it might blend with your paint. If you want to avoid that, you can just wait 5 or 10 minutes, let it dry. But I'm creating fairly precise lines in here, and I'm not too worried about that being an issue in this area just because it is such a controlled application and stroke. Now I'm grabbing some extra Mars Black, and we can come in and make this a little more three-dimensional. So I'll give it a little bit of a darker side. And this will blend with the titanium white. Maybe the edge will be a little bit highlighted from light. So there isn't as much light hitting here, and then more light there, and then less light here. And we can play with it. I'm going to take this same pigment and work it into this one right here. And you can tell that this gray, it's incredibly close to the background there. So I think what we're going to do, we're going to make that one much more high contrast. I'm going to switch over to the smallest flat-headed brush. Make sure it is nice and damp. I'll create a darker gray for this piece of seaweed. That way it actually pops. Going back a couple of times. We're working in a very fine area. I'm using a good amount of water to thin it. And the cost of that is that we have to do more than one layer. I'm also going to go in now and add a bit of a highlight just to the side that's going to be receiving more light. There we go. Now let's do this one. Also use something relatively dark because we have such a bright backdrop in the stonework here. There we go. Make it a little bit darker for the backing. There we are. Do a little bit more up here now. Now these are quite dark with a dark background, so they'll blend in to a good point, but that's okay. You can have areas not all need to stand out. We can have areas that are intentionally more subtle. I'm doing a little bit of a highlight here on the inside because the light's coming in. It'll probably catch that area right there. Make the back of the top here a little bit darker again. And this will be nice because it'll be this little interjection of green throughout the painting. Won't be too much of it, but we'll have little bits of purple and red and all of these other colors in the coral and the fish, but green is kind of an elusive pigment down here. So, by interjecting it into seaweed,
we get to play with that color still. Now, an issue I kind of have here that I didn't realize I was making until now, this, and this, they're all fairly similar heights, so I'm going to want to diversify it, and they're also fairly similar shapes, just kind of mirrored, right? So I'm going to try to incorporate another piece of seaweed, kind of crossing over, and I'll make it a different height, just to kind of disrupt the balance we accidentally created here. And again, don't worry, when you are working from the traceable, all of this will be already fixed and done for you. Just throwing in a couple more at this point. Having them go on top of each other to show that they are three-dimensional. There we go. That looks much more natural. Took a little bit more time, but it all paid off. I'm also going to throw a couple over here. Just some small ones. And then I'll throw a couple over here as well. Of course, we'll need some highlight on our edges. So I'll just come in and play with that, making it nice and subtle, having it overlap a little bit. The highlight here really blends in with the background, unless we bring it a little bit taller, because that's where it gets darker. There we are. So far, so good. Remember, we don't want it to be too bright because it is a bit farther away. We're not in that true highlighted area. I'm just adding a little bit more here. There we go. Now it's subtle. I have this small brush, and with it, I think I'm actually going to go back into the rock and just play with that highlight a little bit more. Give it a little bit more of a texture, so I'm going to do a little bit of a tap in here. Maybe we can have a little bit of moss running, or underwater greenery rather, in here. Give it some extra texture and motion in the foreground. Just trying to make it a little bit more interesting. Less swoopy, to get technical with it. There we are. Now we will continue to proceed by working on some of the seaweed that we have right here. Now this is very dark, so I'm going to start with a bit of a lighter seaweed. That way it's actually visible. Hypothetically, there's some light, it's coming down, it's hitting the top of this, and it's standing out a little bit because of it. Now we can work in the darker background, which may not really be seen, but it can be seen through the highlights of the rocks that are right behind it. And maybe a little bit here on the ocean floor. See, if we applied it to this piece of seaweed, you wouldn't really even know. You really need that highlight. And I can go in and I can blend the two a little bit. As you can see, that way there isn't that hard edge, and that can be nice as well. So here, coming in, making that seaweed, making it a little bit taller. Here we're getting into some bright areas, so I'm going to go back to the darker value. And there can be different types of seaweed with different values, and that can also explain partially why we're going back and forth between the bright and the darker choices for the individual areas, why they don't all necessarily follow the same rules. Here you can see I'm just dropping in a couple more here and there. And it's amazing how much extra detail they can add so quickly. A very versatile subject in these settings. There we are. Now I just have to go back, do this one right here, which will make it a little bit brighter. That is a lot brighter. So it's a good start. It's a nice base. Now we'll darken some of the back, have it look like it's kind of wrapping that light around it. It'll taper it in a little bit too, which is kind of nice. And just catch a little bit of light there. Won't be too bright. But it does stand out against the rock, which is good. It's exactly what we want. Now, I did this one. I don't know if I love how I did the lighting on it, so I'm actually just going to go back and play with it a little bit. Going to add some extra highlight on this side where we had the shadow. Going to bring it up a little bit more. Make it nice and sharp. Let's make this whole area brighter. Come down. I do like the idea of this area being a little bit brighter too, but we'll play with it just so it has some extra gray, some extra movement in there. I feel like it was a little too washed out, a little bit too plainly bright. So just add a little bit more gray, some extra brush strokes in there. I think it'll give it a lot of character. And then I'll make the backside a little bit darker again. There we go. Now that is a nice piece of seaweed. I'm going to take a couple of steps back, just make sure it's progressing the way we want. And at that point, it looks like we actually have covered the entirety of the canvas, which is great because I think we're about 2.5 hours in. With that, I do want to make a couple little changes and do a couple little additions. So if the light's streaming down, we need the light reflecting down here on the ocean floor. So take a little bit of titanium white, take a little bit of our light gray mixture we have, work those two together. I want this to be quite bright. And I also want it to be quite wet. So I'm just going to mix that up. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to make a slightly diagonal line. Going to make another slightly diagonal line and another one. And that looks like a Z, right? Like the letter in the alphabet. So now, let's expand upon it. Let's take that, we'll move it this way, and we'll make another one. But this is the top corner, this is a bottom corner, and then this is a bottom corner. Notice none of them are even. It's diverse. Now let's make another one, but let's have it move upwards a little bit. Okay, now let's make another one. As they get farther away, we'll make them smaller and smaller. We'll apply less pressure. They'll get less bright. And what this is, it's that light reflecting down on the ocean floor. It's a very easy way to make the pattern. And it looks fantastic. You can go back over areas a couple times if you feel they're a little bit too subtle. And then as I get here towards the foreground, I'm applying more pressure, and you can see the strokes are getting larger. That's just because perspective is allowing them to show a bit more of themselves. Remember, as things get closer to you,
they appear larger. They are drawn, they are painted to be bigger. Despite the fact that they are the same size, roughly, as what is in the background. You can also make the pigment slightly more opaque as you move here in the foreground. Going back over things a couple of times, I'm using a little bit more paint rather than water. Be delicate around your foreground subjects, like seaweed here. There we go. And I'm also going to move a bit of it up this rock, because it's not flat, but it's on an angle that could be receiving this same pattern. I'm avoiding the slight shadow effect that we have from this here until we get farther away, at which point I will cross it lightly. It's a quick little effect, but it added so much extra detail here to the foreground, which is really nice. You can even go back and connect a couple of them should you want to. So I'll take this one and that one, we'll just kind of bring them together. We could do that there, but I think I want to keep some of them more spaced. We already have a fairly complicated painting, and I don't want it to become too dominant down here, to the point where we don't look at anything else. So that worked quite well. I've decided that I want to make this fish for the most part yellow, and I can't really add yellow over a value that is that dark. So I'm going to take some extra titanium white, just a hint of Mars black, and I'm going to cover our fish here. I'm going to use a lot of paint because it's really difficult to cover dark values with light values. I'm not going to spread it too much. And I'm not going to use too much water either. Might have to go over this a couple times, but if it remains a little bit darker because of the black underneath, that also isn't really a bad thing. It will just give it a different value, slightly darker value. But I still think this is relatively bright. Going to brighten the top a little bit more than the rest of it, so I'm going in with a slightly more opaque light gray. There we go. We kind of changed the shape of the fish a little bit in the process. It's okay though, I can continue changing it to make it the way we really want it. There we go. Now I want to throw back in those nice stripes it had, so I'm getting some Mars black. Throw that in from the top here. Of course, it'll blend with the very light gray that we have, so it won't be too dark. Maybe we'll make the stripes a little more full. And then we'll go back and we'll add the little eye. And yet again, that's quite cute. Has a little bit more character. The lines aren't as perfect, but I don't know that that's a bad thing.
There we go. Really pops right there. It's essentially one of the brightest values that we have, and it's quite centered, which is great because it really draws the eye in now, and I think that was a great little fix. So from there, I think I'm going to paint in a couple little bubbles, so I'll use a lot of titanium white, a hint of that Mars black. I'll have this coming out of some of this coral here. It's quite bright, so it stands out well against these rocks, which is nice. I'm making little taps, little dots for some of them. I'm trying to space them out well. But I'm also, in the foreground, going to make a little circular shape. I don't need to fully fill it in on all of the edges, just start it, and here we can have some of that really show up in the darker areas, which I like a lot. There we go. Trying to space them out in the canvas well. Just an added extra very easy detail. Just like that. Now I'm going to clean my water, clean my smaller brushes, I suppose all of them really, all of the ones that I've used, and then we'll come back in and we'll apply perhaps the light coming from the top of the water there. So, I'll be back in just a second. So, yet again, we are back. I have some clean water, clean brushes, and in my hand I have a smaller flat-headed brush. I am currently standing as opposed to sitting because I want to create some long dominant strokes here on the canvas, and if I was sitting I might make them in little compartmentalized strokes that then kind of fit together in a way that looks a little more organic, kind of in the way you do bark on a tree rather than a long streak of light. So I'm standing, and what we're going to do here, I'm going to take this brush, it doesn't have any paint on it, I'm just going to add some water, and I'm going to practice with water on my brush here and on my canvas. So I'm just going to pick some areas where I want the light to be streaming in, and I'm just going to draw it with water. I know that I want it to move through here, so I'll try this, follow it up to here. And my stroke wasn't perfect, but it was relatively close, and that's good. I think I like that a lot, so now that I know that I like it, and I know that that's the direction I want to go in, I can take a little bit of titanium white, move it over here on my palette, make it nice and watery, very transparent, and then I'll start from the top, and just blend it down as so. I'll go back over the edges a couple of times. This will make it slightly more thick, but it'll also give us a slightly softer edge, which can be nice. You can go back over it a couple times if you want it to look much wider. Take a little bit more paint if you run out in that process of making it wider. Take a step back, see how it looks. So far I think so good. If you want to work reductively with this, you can just add a lot of water to your brush, go over to the edge of it, kind of push it inwards through these strokes that move up and down, and then peel it off with your fingers. Just like that. You need to be relatively quick with that decision though, because it needs to occur before it starts drying. So here I'm just moving it in, showing you that's wholly achievable. I like to make the edges, for the most part, a little bit more dominant, a little bit harder.
And this can be a great way of doing that because you're pushing that paint as you're pushing it. It's getting this slightly harder line. And it's very soft right now. That's how I definitely advise you begin this process. Start with a very soft application. And then once you know it's actually where you like it, then you can kind of come back in, as I am here, and re-incorporate more of that, thickening it, making it slightly more opaque, but build it in very subtle layers, especially initially. When you're on your second, third, fourth kind of stream of light here, then yeah, you can work with a little bit more opaque paint. You can be a little more confident with it, but that's because you've done it a couple of times. You're in practice, you're ready. When you're just starting, start with very thin pigment. Have it going behind this, coming back out the other side, taking a step back, making sure it's what I want. I feel like it curves a little bit in here. Make it a little bit more straight. There we go. Grab some more paint, move it off to the side of my palette. Make it nice and watery. Let's add another one coming from here, but we'll have it going over this right here. Tried to keep that as a fairly succinct line. I didn't want too many breaks in it. Now I'll blend this out. They don't all need to be wide like this one was. In fact, I think it's best to have a lot of smaller ones instead. But having one or two wide ones can be nice. But it'll make this one significantly more tapered. Kind of soften the edge here with my finger, just blend it back and forth. Mix up a bit more, come back, do another line, like so. Now I don't like how it exactly touches the edge here. That's something you want to avoid. You want it to stop somewhere in negative space. Space that doesn't have detail. So I can either bring it forward a little bit or I can have it come back a little bit. I think this worked well. We'll continue. So far, so good. I'm being quite thoughtful with where each is going, how it's changing. And you can tell they're not all going in the exact same direction. They're starting to turn out a little bit, like hands of a clock. So this one's going here, this one's going this way, this one's going more this way. It's not this very similar change. And you also don't want the space in between them to be too similar. You want it to be more varied. So you know what, I'll add another one right here. I'll make it quite small. I made that through a series of smaller strokes. Again, that isn't how I'd advise doing this, really. It's best when you can make it one succinct long stroke. There we go. But that's good, it has some diversity. Making them different sizes is important. Here I'll come down like so. I feel like the dramatic change here from going this way to being that way, it's a little too harsh, so I'll move it a little bit. Have this edge just kind of get lost, doing a lot of blending. I can extend this one a little bit more this way, and you can see that it's slowly adopting a similar angle, but again, it's a little bit different, as they should all be. You can even overlap a couple of them. So here, that's overlapped. I'll do another one there. I don't want them to be the same length, so I'll shorten that a little bit through a blend. There we go. Taking a couple of steps back. Do one more over here. Make it relatively tapered. Going back over it a couple times. And I'm quite happy with the selection we have there, with the angles, with how far they move down. But now I'm going to go back up to the top of the ones that I really like. And I'm going to add a little bit more highlight. Why am I doing this? Because the most light will be happening at the top, and then it will slowly dissipate as we move down. So here you can see I'm even skipping a couple little areas. That way it looks slightly sectional. Gives it that added level of detail, makes it look like maybe there's something happening in the water that's stopping that stream of light in one way or another. Maybe it's something on the surface, maybe it's something underwater, but it adds that diversity we need. So remember, make it a little bit brighter at the top. And then we can go back in and blend those brighter strobes in. I find that I create a much more straight line by going upwards than I do downwards. I would practice both, see which works best for you. The angle that you're sitting and applying paint will probably have an effect on it, whether you are right or left-handed will probably have an effect on it, whether you are sitting or standing will probably have an effect on it. So there are a lot of variables to play with, but find whatever renders the sharpest result for you. Here I'm going back a couple of times to this one. It was the first. It's something I want to be a little bit more dominant. There we are. I feel like that is so pretty. Add a little bit of light kind of streaking down from this one. Soften it. And I can even continue that down here. By having light go behind and in front of the arch, we make it much more three-dimensional. Here I'm also just taking a little bit of that extra titanium white that's very thin. I'm just brightening the top as a whole a little bit. There we are. At this point we're in practice and it's nice and easy. But anyways, I think there we have it for our achromatic layer, which is great. That is the majority of our painting. The next part is easy. It's simply adding color. We don't have to worry about depth. We don't have to worry about value because we've split the painting up in these two ways. It just makes the remainder of the painting process a wholly cathartic, easy experience. Now, for glazing, what we are going to need is entirely clean brushes and clean water. Otherwise, the dark pigments can dilute the lighter colors that we're going to use and make them kind of muddy and dirty. We don't want that, so we want very clean brushes, very clean water. I'm going to clean off my palette, apply some actual colors to it. They will be listed in the video description, but I will also talk about them as I apply them, and we'll also do a talk about how to glaze for those of you who are new and haven't done so before. Also, as a little reminder for those of you who are just kind of getting started with it. So we'll do that. We'll actually do the glazing, and then we will be done our second seascape here. Really look forward to it. So I'm not going to ramble any longer, just going to start cleaning, and I'll be back in just a second. Oh, actually, I would like to add quickly, make sure that all of it has good time to dry. Make sure it is 100% entirely dry. That is very necessary for the glazing process, otherwise we can kind of strip off previously applied paint. As long as it is fully dry, that is not an issue, it is not something to worry about, but because we want this to be as good as it can be, let it dry for 20 to 30 minutes maybe, just to be absolutely sure, and then come right back. Now is a great time to make some tea, make some coffee, a snack, all of that good stuff. So again, be right back, and we will continue our painting process. So we are back from our little extended break, and as you can see, I now have clean brushes, clean water, a dried canvas, and a new palette of paint here, and we are ready to start glazing. But what is glazing? Glazing is essentially when you take an incredibly thin pigment, generally of a color, and you apply it atop a previously dried pigment. And because the new pigment is so thin, you're essentially just adding a wash of color. You're not disrupting any of the line work, you're not really changing any of the values, you're just applying color. But how do we get the paint to get thin enough to the point where we can apply these washes? We actually, here on the channel, just use water. And water is a great way to thin paint, as we know from the rest of the painting process. You can go out and you can buy a medium, however I personally like to use water because it's something we already do use, it's something we're familiar with. The more we use it in the painting process, the more familiar with it we'll be when we get into glazing. And the more we glaze, the more we'll use it, and the better we'll be at the general painting process. So it's something that kind of works in a circle, it feeds itself, it's a really good way of going about learning your mediums because you just become so familiar with them, and that's what I'll be using here today. So to begin, let's talk about the colors that I have here. You don't need all of them. All you really need is a yellow, a blue, a red, a brown, a white, and a black. So I have a lot of colors, and that's just so I have a little bit more option. It makes it a little bit more fun. Here I have a primary yellow. This is a light blue permanent, cerulean blue, French ultramarine blue. This is a cadmium red light hue. This is a burnt sienna, primary red, brilliant purple, a Mars black, and a titanium white. You can mix a purple by just taking a red and a blue, putting them together. Use a little bit more red than blue because blue is generally a stronger pigment. This is essentially burnt umber with a little bit more warmth in it, so a little bit of red and yellow. This is essentially red with a little bit of yellow in it. Here we have an ultramarine blue, which is essentially a blue with a hint of red. Then I have my cerulean blue, which is essentially a primary blue with a little bit of primary yellow. Then I have a light blue permanent, which is essentially a primary blue with a good amount of titanium white. And then I do have a primary yellow. So again, very simple. If you're used to working with the primary colors, you can mix a lot of this yourself. You don't need all of these, but I find it fun now working with these colors, and that's what I intend to do here today. So to begin, I'm going to take my larger flat-headed brush. I think I'm going to sit down for a bit of this process, just so we can get some very precise strokes going on. And I'm going to begin by making sure that the tip of the brush is quite damp, if not wet. Then I'm going to take some of my cerulean blue that we have right here. I'm going to move it out into my palette. Then I'm going to take some extra water and make it incredibly thin. See, I'm just adding it. It's just starting to take the consistency of watercolor rather than acrylic paint. And then I'm going to take this, I'm going to apply it up here at the top of the painting, and I'm going to start blending it out. The more we blend it, the less kind of granular it will look. And you can see that as I continue, it gets better and better. In the beginning, I'm going to try to avoid my seaweed in the foreground and my coral and all of that. Though if I go over it, that is okay. We can go over it a couple of times with additional colors. And that's something that's great about glazing. Start with a very minimal amount of color and then slowly add to it. The more you add, the more saturation it'll get, the more color you can play with. But you can start with a minimal amount, just so you understand the medium, understand what you're doing with it. And here you can see I'm starting to do my brush strokes in the same direction as the light in the water, and that's just so if any brush strokes do tend to show through, or do show through rather, then we have the stroke going in the same way and it looks natural. Now I started to run out of pigment, so I'll just grab a bit more, start throwing it on this side as well, and again, look, when we start applying it, it has this very toothy look. You can see the tooth of the canvas showing through, but as we continue to work it, we thin it out a little bit, we play with it, it subsides, it gets much better, and we're able to continue that process. Going to move down here now, covering the back land masses. We'll work in here, and you know what, it'll actually cover the edge of this right here. Get a little bit of blue in it. It's nice. A little bit more in here. Here you can see I'm adding a little bit more of a thick paint to the canvas, and then I'm just turning it into this watery mixture once it's there. That's also an option, though it's a little bit less controlled, so I would wait till you're fairly confident with glazing before you really start playing with it in that manner. Now here I didn't end up moving a lot of this paint around, so it's still a little bit, just a little bit, granular, so I'm just going to move that about. And I got a bit of it over my fish, and the fish is one thing I don't want it on because it's going to be yellow, and if we put yellow on top of blue, it's going to mix to make green. So I'm just going to strip off some of this paint by taking a very clean brush, taking off all that paint, just using the corner of it, and here you can see I'm just moving it about. It's like using an eraser, but I'm not erasing it, I'm moving it to the edges. So I'm just pushing it back and forth until it is no longer covering my fish. And then you'll probably have a little bit of extra on the edge, so I'm going to come back in to those edges and just move that paint out a little bit, like so. Nice and easy. If you feel the paint's too thick in any area, you can just kind of scrape it about. Or you can use your finger, as I am here, to move it about. So you have a lot of option with glazing. Try not to think about how quickly it dries and kind of psych yourself out. Recognize that it does take a while to dry because it is so wet, and you have time to do things right. Here I'm adding some more blue to the background, so you can see. Move it down around my coral using the sharp edge of my brush. I'm going over a little bit of it, but that's okay. I'm not too concerned. And then those final strokes are more so in that direction of the light that's beaming in. There we are. Now sometimes when you glaze, you can kind of move paint to a certain area, and here you can see that more dense area of saturation, so I'm just going to move that out with a little bit more water. Here I added a lot of water, so it started to strip it off a little bit, and now you have this gray area, but that's okay. All we need is more pigment. And now we have a lot of blue paint right here on this light that's streaming in. I can just use the corner of my brush to strip that off. I can do that here as well if I want it to be extra bright. But having a little bit of blue in it is quite nice. There we go. So you can see I'm just going back and playing with things, taking my time, having fun. I'm stripping a little bit of paint off where I feel it might be a little bit too blue. And this should all just show you that you have a lot of option when you're working on this. Now I'm going to take a couple of steps back, see how it's turning out. And that looks quite nice actually, I like it a lot. I want to go back up and I want to add a little bit more blue here, but I wanted to dry a little bit first just because there's so much water, it's a little bit difficult to work with. And it's important to recognize that while we're working with a lot of water, we do need to still be calculated with the amount we use, because at a certain point it will be difficult to work with. So that's something I'm trying to keep in the back of my head as I work on this. Now I also want to do the ocean floor in this nice cerulean blue. So I'm just mixing more of that paint, come into the foreground here, apply this throughout using those sharp edges to work around my coral. I'll go over some of the foreground rock though, working in and about my starfish, my seaweed, all of that good stuff. And here I have a lot of paint, so I'm actually just going back, I'm picking it up, and I'm moving it about. Again, I like to start with a minimal amount in each area, and then I build on it until I get what I actually want. It's a little bit more measured. There we go. That looks quite nice though. I like that. Starting to look like the ocean it is. Here I'm working on a rock around my yellow fish, so I'm going to be fairly careful just using the corner of my brush. If I go over it, remember we do know how to take it off. It is okay, but it's nice if we don't have to. There we go. Going over a bit of my seaweed, and that's one thing I'm really not concerned about going over, because seaweed is going to be green. And when we add a little bit of yellow on top of that seaweed, it will become green. So it's fairly easy to work with the blues. We avoid the fish because it'll turn it into a green and we don't want it to, but we do want the seaweed too. While I'm using a lot of water, I am still having to go back and grab more paint here and there. We are still using a relative amount of paint. It isn't great, but it is to the point where we do need to kind of reload our brush and palette here and there. There we are. That's nice. Now yet again, I'm going to take some steps back and just make sure it's all progressing the way we want it to. Oh, I like that a lot. Look how bright that area is. That's really nice. Okay, so I think we can continue at this point and start working in some other color. So I'm going to take my French Ultramarine blue, pull that out here on my palette, and this, it's a little bit warmer, it's a little bit of a deeper blue. Again, you can mix it by adding a little bit of primary red to primary blue, just a little bit. And I'm going to work this more so around my edges and my corners. And I'm going to do so because it's going to give it a little bit more of a deep look. It's going to give it a bit more of a darker look, a little more vignetted, as you can see. And then I'll slowly just blend it into the middle there. I don't want any hard lines though, so I am going back and I'm doing more blends. There we go. Going to stand back, make sure that's progressing. It is so far. I'll take some more of this blue, work it back in here. This would be a nice color for that darker corner. We can even put a little bit back here. Not much though. There we are. Now I know the the painting got quite blue there quite quickly, and now it's not as blue. That wasn't actually the glaze, it was just a cloud moving over and making some cooler light here on the painting. So interesting thing to kind of consider while going about your painting and glazing, the light that is affecting it. So all of that is quite good. Now I'm going to start moving into some actual color, and I'm going to take my medium-sized flat-headed brush for this. I'm going to make sure that it's nice and damp. I'm going to grab a little bit of our primary red, a little bit of our cadmium red light hue, a little bit more. I'll mix those up, put that in our water, and now I'll come in and start working on some of our coral that we have in the background. And I'm going over areas that are slightly blue, and that is okay. They are going to blend, it's going to look nice and cohesive. And as you can see, it's going to be quite subtle in this first layer. But that's what we want. We want the opportunity to build and play with it. The added more orangey tones from the cadmium red light hue are going to work really well against the blues. It's going to make it pop, even when it's just a subtle amount of saturation. And that's because it is the complementary color of blue, which means they're opposite each other on the color wheel. I talk about this a lot in my ebook Acrylics for Beginners, but essentially because they are across from each other on that color wheel, they make each other really stand out. There we go. So I'm going back, I'm making some of them more vibrant, saturated than others. Here I'll jump over to the other side of the canvas. Start doing some of these, and all of your coral doesn't have to be the same color. You can play with it. I'm going with something that's a little bit more uniform just because it's such a visually complicated piece already, just from the perspective of all of the subjects that we already have in here. But you are more than welcome to play with it and balance it differently. Here I'm grabbing a little bit of my burnt sienna, just to give it a little bit more of a reddish, earthy tone. There you go. It's a little more saturated here in the foreground. There's less blue water kind of in between it and us, so we get to see those vibrant colors to a greater degree. Here it's a little watery, so it's starting to bleed down and drip. It's okay, we can just take that off quite easily and then move it back. Nice and simple. There we are. Now let's continue having some fun and adding some additional color. So I'll take a little bit of my primary red, take a little bit of my French ultramarine blue, and I'll mix these up to make a little bit of a purple here. I also have this lighter purple that we could use. Grab a hint of it. Or you can lighten it with a titanium white, but titanium white is quite thick, so it'll thicken your glaze. That isn't necessarily the worst thing though, and you can also get something like a zinc white, which is a much more transparent white, which can be great in that scenario as well with glazing. So here I'm just working some purple onto the foreground. I'll work a bit here into the background. Just like that. Need some over here, make it cohesive.
Just kind of filling in open spots at this point, looking for other fun areas we can place it in. I like it because it's subtle with the blue. It isn't this extremely poppy, vibrant color, which is nice. Good to have some subtle variations in here. Take a bit of this burnt sienna, I'll move that out. Take a hint of our cadmium red light hue, mix those two together right here. And I think I'll add just a slight hint of this to our arch. Give it almost a little bit of a bronze look under the water. There we go. It's so much more diverse just like that. But you can tell, just by the amount we used, how different this looks from this, right? We're essentially using really similar, if not the same, pigments, but because of the amounts we're incorporating, we're getting a very different look. There we are. Take a little bit of it and incorporate it up here, but I'm going to incorporate even less because it's farther away, and I want that to be much more subtle. You can get a little bit more highlight, throw it on the edge here, just a little bit where that light's hitting, give it a little bit more of its own natural pigment, but not too much. There we go. Now, I'd like to start working on some seaweed and some greenery. So I'll take my primary yellow here, mix it over here on my palette with a bit of my cerulean blue. See, we get this really nice, lush, underwater green. And I'll take this and I can start applying it atop my seaweed. And just like this, all of that seaweed that was once lost in the background, lost in the blue, now has its own identity. It's much more interesting. Green is generally a great color to play with when glazing. It just works really well over both light and dark values. There we are. So we're just kind of picking a color, whether it be red, purple, green, and working our way around, adding it where it makes sense, but also where we see it fits. Just continuously trying to balance the painting as we work on it. Now this is quite thick right here. I'm just going to thin it out a little bit more. Now it's very watery. Going to go over some of these areas a couple times. There we go. Lots of little areas to capture. Remember, if you use too much water, it can become a little bit drippy, which I actually like the aesthetic of. I think it adds to a painting quite nicely, gives it this very painterly effect. But if you want it to look entirely clean, then I would use a little bit less water. It's all about finding that balance. Here I'm going back and I'm just stripping off a little bit of that green here and there to reveal some highlights in the seaweed. See that? Well, when we are glazing, we're essentially adding color and not changing the value much. If you add a lot of color, then you do start to change the value a little bit. So, here I'm just working backwards, a little bit correctively, and adding that back into the painting. I'm going to take a couple of steps back
see how it's progressing. Again, so far so good. But I think it's time that we start incorporating a little bit of greenery in the moss and whatnot. So I'm going to take some ultramarine blue this time, mix that with our primary yellow. It'll give us a bit of a deeper green, a little bit of a darker green. And we can incorporate this right up here. I want a couple of different greens in here just to make it more diverse and interesting. There we go. Have a bit of that kind of growing here as well. And in there. Now I like this color, this kind of rocky color, and there's a lot of rock down here, right? So let's add a little bit of that into our foreground as well. Not going to use as much of our cadmium red light here. I'm going to stick more to the burnt sienna. We're just going to work this into the real areas of the foreground, and it'll give us some extra life here. Now my brush has a bit of green on it, my water has a bit of green on it, so I'm not getting that pure orange or that pure brown anymore. I am moving a bit of green about, and that's because we're working with such diluted paint on such a diluted brush. So we need to be careful at this point, and I think the best next step post doing the moss and that sort of thing is actually to clean our water, clean our brush, and then come back in. That way we aren't interjecting brown and green into every other color we mixed. If we tried to go for yellow right now, we wouldn't get a yellow, we would get a green because that yellow would quickly turn to a green. So, next up, I'm going to clean everything, and then I'll be right back, and we'll continue adding some vibrancy to this, and we're also going to do some extra fish as well. So, we have some fun things ahead. So, yet again, we are back, clean water, clean brush, and we can continue working on our painting. So for this next step, I think I'm actually going to take my smaller flat-headed brush because I want to be a little bit more detail-oriented. And I'm going to take some of this nice primary yellow, move that out here, take a hint of titanium white, thicken it up a little bit, make it a little bit brighter, make it a little bit more watery, and then I'll come in and I will paint our fish. And it will be amazing just how much this pops in the rest of the painting, because it's such a bright value, but also because we don't have any other yellow. And when you incorporate a pigment in a single area, then it tends to really pop and stand out. And that's exactly what's happening here. Now this isn't going to be the only yellow we have, but it's a good lesson to learn in the process. Now I'm going to take some of this, and I'm actually going to add a hint of it into our archway here. Just give it a bit of a different color. Make it a little more interesting. Just like so. Also blend it out a little bit more. Give it a bit more character and saturation. There we go, I think that's a nice addition. Let's also take some of this yellow and throw it into a couple of our areas of coral. Not all of them, just a couple. It'll blend with a lot of the red and make more of an orange, which is nice. In some accounts, it will actually be more of a yellow. But in a lot of these cases, it'll just make it much more interesting. You saw just how strong that yellow is on the fish, what it did in the painting. And I think we actually need to go down, or go and tone it down a little bit. But it's a really good lesson. So we're just taking it and we're working it throughout, brightening some of these areas. Can add a little bit of yellow back into the background there, into a different type of coral, maybe into this one as well.
Just changing and amalgamating those colors. Now, let's take a little bit of an orange, a little bit of that yellow, and we'll mix up nice new pigment. I'm going to take a step back, kind of get an idea of where I want to place it, and I think we'll saturate some more of these again. See, every time we add a layer, we A, make the color more interesting, but B, we saturate it further. Make it pop more. There we go. I think I'll make this coral right here quite similar, that nice orangey yellow. Worked quite well. Now, as you can tell, the water's starting to turn a little bit green, so we can only use this for so long, just because we are working on tops of blues and other things. But I still have it as a yellow, so I'm going to keep that for a minute. I'm going to take a bit of that yellow titanium white, a little more yellow. And I can add highlights into our seaweed here. Just where you think the light would be hitting it. Sometimes when a green gets a lot of highlight, a lot of light, it can look a little bit yellow. And this is just a great way of spreading it about in the painting, giving it some extra life, diversifying our colors more, but also making our colors match more, be more cohesive. So we really get to do a lot with this. Oh, that's pretty. That worked out really well. And a lot of this is trial and error. There are formulas, there are ways of thinking about it, but really the best way is to try it, see if you like it. If not, that's okay, you can take it off, you can repaint it. Oh, that's such a nice effect. Glad we tried. Add some here, the background a little bit. It'll kind of tie it into the yellows in this, which is nice. But as I get farther and farther away, I'm going to apply less and less. Remember that saturation is, for the most part, reserved for areas of the foreground, because the farther back you get, the more blue is going to reflect on those subjects. There we go. That's really what I wanted this to look like. Made a big difference. Very beautiful. Now I'm going to take some of my brilliant purple, a little bit of my titanium white, because my water is starting to turn a little bit green and I do want to move away from the yellow at this point. Should we want to incorporate more, I can go back to it with clean water. But I'm just going to take some of this brighter purple and I'm going to tap in the highlights again in some of this coral that's in the background in these more purpley areas. Here in the foreground as well. You can see just how much of an effect that has. We are changing the value at this point, but that's okay, we can adjust as we go, make it how we like. I think it's much more fun now. Can even take little bits of purple and throw them into our coral. This area over here, it's quite dark, so I'm just trying to play with it a lot, make it more interesting through saturation and blended saturations. Now I'm going to go back into a little bit of green, so you know what, I can use that yellow that might be a little bit green right now. We'll just tap on some highlights down here. connect them. I'm being very loose with my brush. There we go. That looks like it's full of life. Even take some highlighted versions of the orangey yellow. Some titanium white to thicken it, to brighten it. And we can add those pops of color in this coral right here. And we can add it to some of the sides of this. The red coral. That is now no longer truly a red coral, but an amalgamation of lots of different beautiful colors. There we go. I think we'll take some orange, some of that yellow, some of our white, and we'll work in some starfish. All of your starfish don't have to be the same color. You can change it as they're moving through them, as I am here. There we go. Quite nice. Also going to take a little bit more of that orange and burnt sienna now. Move it into there. That is far too much. Should have been much more watery. I can take that off like that. Very wet brush. Just wipe off the excess paint here on my mat. But now that the rest of the painting's a little more saturated, I feel confident in making the stonework here a little bit more saturated. There we go. I'm also going to brighten some of these highlights that we have down in the water, so I'll take some light blue permanent and some titanium white. And I'll just go over those again. Remember, they should be smaller as we move into the distance. And be careful when you mix into your water. If you feel like you're taking your blue, you're putting it in this yellow and it's turning green on the canvas, clean your water and your brush before you proceed to do this. There we go. Figure we've probably put 3 hours into this painting at this point, so we might as well just make it as good as we can, right? What's an extra half hour of detail? A good thing. There we are. Now I'm going to darken portions of this fish. Take some Mars Black, move it out here on my palette. I will reinitiate these stripes that we had. And generally I don't advise using a pure Mars Black or titanium white. Make a little exception here. Take a little bit of that primary yellow. When you mix them, they'll make not necessarily a darker yellow, but more of a green. That's okay though. I'll work this around the bottom of the fish where it won't be receiving as much light. And I'll just bring it up slowly with lots of little taps for a nice little even blend there. Then I'll throw a little bit more on the top of the fish just to make sure that it's three-dimensional. I'm allowing the edge to be a little bit brighter. Work on its eye there. There we go. I'll also create lots of little yellowfish. I did this in the other one and I loved it. And I think it'll be a nice addition here. So I'll just create these little ovals initially. You can put a little triangle behind them, maybe a little fin on top of some of them. We just have this collection of other smaller little yellow fish kind of following. It'll create a leading line towards our fish. We can have them coming from the other side here, so it looks like they're kind of going in between. They'll get smaller as they move into the distance. I'm applying less pressure, they're becoming more transparent. And of course we can have them in front of our large one here as well. But the closer we get, I think the more detail we should incorporate. I'm also going to take this opportunity to add a little bit more of a highlight into our starfish here. There we go. Maybe this one too. Nice when it has a collection of colors rather than just one. I'll also add some of these fish in the back here, kind of moving to the foreground. You can have them kind of swimming in from behind. This one's catching a little bit of light from that ray, so it's a bit brighter. And maybe they're swimming behind there. So this is where the life of the painting really comes in. Can do a couple kind of through here, and I need to add a lot of titanium white to thicken this. Yellow is generally a very thin pigment. Having these on top of our previously painted subjects. And I didn't draw these in initially and try to work around them just because there are so many. It would be really difficult to do, so it's easier to just kind of paint them in at the end. Starting to run out of paint, it's getting a little transparent. So, rather than just continuing, having it look incomplete, grab some extra paint and work that in. There we go. Going back a couple of times to thicken up some of these and to work on fins for the ones in the foreground. There we are. Take a little bit of this yellow, tap it onto the top moss here, make it cohesive. I'll take a little bit more, work it right into this as well. Really adding a lot of life to the painting. Now that we have so much yellow and green, I feel like we can do more orange and burnt sienna again. So I'm mixing those two up here. And I'll make a couple of these much more prominent. There we go. It's a nice and bright painting now. Kind of just creating other little areas of coral throughout. As you can see there. Just a couple taps will do it. But it is in that shadowy area, so I want it to be a little bit darker, so I'll take a hint of Mars Black, work that in with some burnt sienna, and then just darken that area a little bit. There we go. Cleaning my brush. I think I want a hint of pink in the painting as well, so I'll take some primary red, titanium white, mix those two up. And this is something we haven't added yet, so we need to be fairly selective, think about where we want to add it, and I think a good area to start is into some of the coral, just because we have so many of these warmer colors in there that the pink's just kind of a natural addition. Can also add some highlights into our purple coral. They generally work really well together. Might add a couple hints up here with a couple little taps. There we go. And I think I'll take a couple of steps back, kind of see how it's going after I just add a little bit of pink in here too. Not too much. I think it'll just make it a really pretty color. Yeah, those all blended together so well. Liked it so much I went back and added a little bit more. There we go. You can take a bunch of these different colors and throw them up in here as well now. Maybe a little bit in our close land masses as well. There we are. That's really nice. See just how quickly that diversified the painting? Can add a little bit more in here too. Add some hints of it in here. And if we're doing that, we can definitely throw some down here as well. So it's one of those things where I didn't necessarily plan it, but as the painting progressed, you just kind of learn what you can do with it, what it asks for. You can even add a little bit of this into the ocean floor as well. I'm not going to do much at all though. I really like the blue that we have. I think all of that blue light reflecting down is a beautiful thing. So I'm just going to add hints of it. Blend it out here and there. But I'm bringing it down here so that it's cohesive with the rest of the painting. Here, I'll soften it. And now that we have all of that color over there, I think we need it over here as well. That is a lot of saturation. But maybe this could be a large piece of coral instead. I think it's definitely doing a massive amount of work for this painting. It's quickly just giving it this added subtlety I felt like kind of needed. That said, you are more than welcome to glaze your painting however you'd like. Play with the colors you like, play with the effects you'd like. You don't have to do everything I'm doing. Play with your favorite colors too. Have fun. Just adding a little bit more of this warmer value into the back of this rock. There we are. I left the blue highlight. I think that's really pretty. And you can actually take more blue highlight. And again, if you find when you're working with blue at this point and it's turning into a green because you have dirty water or dirty brush, please clean those before proceeding. You can take a little bit of blue light here, work it along the edges, the things that are really going to get a lot of that blue light. And it's just this added nice little detail. There we go. That way, when you take the blue out of it, you can still have that nice blue watery effect. Can even add hints of it to some of your seaweed if you didn't go with the brighter yellow. And I'm also going to use this to kind of reincorporate some of those bubbles. Because as we glaze, some of them got different colors, they got a little bit darker. Maybe we lost some of them. It's a really nice effect. There we go.
Now, again, I took a couple of steps back, and I felt like this area right here is just a little bit bland. It's very green. It doesn't have the variety that this does. And so I think it further kind of instills the idea that I want to make this more a large piece of coral in the same way I did these. So I'm just going to start by taking a little bit of our cadmium red light hue, working that in, and already that stands out marvelously. There we go. Take a bit more. Come in here. Quickly defining the subject. Then we'll make some pink, because we found pink to work really well in the others. Maybe we'll do it with a little bit of a tapped effect. Give it some interesting texture. Don't have to bring it all the way in or all the way through. We can skip little areas. We don't want to completely cover it in pink. We just want pink to be a nice accent. And of course, you can just blend it in the same way that you did everything else. Take some burnt sienna. We have a lot of that in the others. There we go. Beautiful. Now the edges are fairly highlighted on these, so I think we need to go in with a slightly lighter value. Take some of that titanium white, move it into the cadmium red light hue, the burnt sienna. And we'll bring that up. There we go. That area got a little light, so we can make it a hint darker by some Mars Black and some burnt sienna at the bottom. Can reincorporate that elsewhere as well. Can even do it in a different pattern, like a tap or a stroke, to again reinitiate some added texture. This is really how I love to paint. I love to go in with an idea, but I love it at the end when you can just kind of play, try things out. I feel like that's when painting is the most fun for me.
There we go. Want to go back in and just kind of solidify a line up there. Mix some of our pinks and our oranges. And I can tap some of this in, create more of that texture. There we are. And I'll add a little bit more orange now into this, just because this side did get brighter again. We can add more into this. It's a little too much, just scrape it off there with my finger. Go with a little bit more of a pink. Kind of giving this archway here a lot of the same colors as the coral, which is making it all feel very cohesive. That hints up here. There we go. Now, the painting has one more step, and that is to add a little bit more light coming in from the top. However, to do that, this needs to be entirely dry. I need clean brushes and I need clean water. So, I'm going to take a 15 to 20 minute break, let all of that dry well. I'll be back, and then we will finish our underwater seascape. So, yet again, we are back, and now the canvas is dry, so we can continue with our painting. And here I just want to further accentuate some of these rays of light, and I'm going to do so with my medium-sized round-headed brush because I don't want a truly hard edge for this final application. Now I'm going to begin here by making sure that it's nice and damp, as we generally do. I'm going to take a little bit of light blue permanent. I'm going to take a good amount of our titanium white, mix those two together, make it a little bit more watery. And I'll come up to the most important one to begin with. And because I have the main lines done, I can be a little bit more segmented with how I'm applying it. And I'll just have this light kind of streaming in, as so. As you can see, it gets softer and softer the more we blend. That makes sense. Do a little bit more there. Brighten that up a little bit. This one too. You can tell how just nice and soft this all is. I'm going to take a fairly damp version of that brush without pigment and just come in and further work on those edges. There we go. See how it's softening it? Just moving that brightness out a little bit. Might let it be a little bit sharper down here, just because it's such a sharply defined area, subject-wise. There we go. Just kind of playing with it, making it a little bit more interesting. When we go back and do this, we can add extra details, extra areas. Some of these lines are a little bit sharp, but I am okay with that. I just didn't want them all to be as hard as our initial application. And we have these really soft blends out this way now too. Grab this one. It actually moves in front of our arch here, which is nice. But because acrylic paints are so transparent, and it's difficult to apply pigment over, or light pigment over dark pigment, I'm going to go in and I'm going to do a couple of layers on that one. While I wait for that to dry a little bit, I'll come over here, further enhance those. It's a little detail that we're doing here at the end, but it's making a big difference. It's a great effect in a lot of paintings. I actually often feel like I want to incorporate this in more paintings that we do, but I feel like I already do it in so many that I need to do a couple without it. That said, you are always welcome to incorporate it in any or all of them. There we go. Being fairly careful with the white I'm dipping into there, just because there's some yellows, some reds, and some other pigments that have kind of diluted areas of it. And I don't want that. I want this to be nice and clean up here. Going up, brightening the tops. And then we can throw a couple little areas of highlight in as well. There we are. You can also take some of that extremely bright highlight and work it into the middle area here of the ocean floor where it's the brightest, where it'll catch the most light. It's coming in, hitting around here. Take a couple of steps back, see how it's going. So far, really, really well. I like that a lot. But now that we have this very bright value, I feel like we almost need to darken some of the other values just to get that nice contrast. So I'm going to take my medium-sized flat-headed brush, a little bit of my Mars Black here, get a bit of burnt sienna, and I will darken this area at the back here. Just further solidify this vignette effect. Make this a little more dramatic. Oh, that's really nice too. It's amazing how much of the painting just gets to that great stage at that very end point. It's just all of those little touch-ups that bring everything together, bring in that final amount of contrast. And here we are changing the value of our subjects a bit, but I think it's very much for the better. Making everything a little bit more stark here in the foreground because we have less water interrupting our view of the subjects, so they can be much more dominant. There we go. Mix up a little bit more here. Come back in. Blend the edges, kind of create a little bit of texture. Just make sure that it doesn't look too hard and out of place. I'm also going to throw a little bit of it back here in this rock, which is slightly difficult because we have so many fish now and lots of seaweed, but it is doable. And I'm just going to be relatively careful through the process, starting it at the bottom, and then I work my way upwards around all of our subjects. Just has so much. So, yet again, we are back, and now the canvas is dry, so we can continue with our painting. And here I just want to further accentuate some of these rays of light, and I'm going to do so with my medium-sized round-headed brush because I don't want a truly hard edge for this final application. Now I'm going to begin here by making sure that it's nice and damp, as we generally do. I'm going to take a little bit of light blue permanent. I'm going to take a good amount of our titanium white, mix those two together, make it a little bit more watery. And I'll come up to the most important one to begin with. And because I have the main lines done, I can be a little bit more segmented with how I'm applying it. And I'll just have this light kind of streaming in, as so. As you can see, it gets softer and softer the more we blend. That makes sense. Do a little bit more there. Brighten that up a little bit. This one too. You can tell how just nice and soft this all is. I'm going to take a fairly damp version of that brush without pigment and just come in and further work on those edges. There we go. See how it's softening it? Just moving that brightness out a little bit. Might let it be a little bit sharper down here, just because it's such a sharply defined area, subject-wise. There we go. Just kind of playing with it, making it a little bit more interesting. When we go back and do this, we can add extra details, extra areas. Some of these designs are a little bit sharp, but I am okay with that. I just didn't want them all to be as hard as our initial application. And we have these really soft blends out this way now too. Grab this one. It actually moves in front of our arch here, which is nice. But because acrylic paints are so transparent, and it's difficult to apply pigment over, or light pigment over dark pigment, I'm going to go in and I'm going to do a couple of layers on that one. While I wait for that to dry a little bit, I'll come over here, further enhance those. Now I'm going to just quickly pop back in here, take a little bit of our primary yellow, mix it with a little bit of that Mars black, create a slight blend between the darker mixture that we have right here and the lighter. And I'll do that at the top and the bottom. Make it nice and cohesive. Bring it up. Make sure that this is equally well done. And a little bit over here as well. And with that, there we have it. That is today's hour, but probably closer to 4-hour long painting. It was a pleasure to put this much time, this much effort, and this much care into a piece. I thank you for watching these longer videos, for supporting these longer videos the way that you do. If you made it this far, hit that like button, help the video out. But thank you for spending this time here with me today. It was a pleasure. I say today, over the multiple days we spent painting this. And I have a lot of canvases currently up in the studio ready for paint, and I'm excited to get to those and get them out to you as well. So thank you for stopping by. If somehow miraculously you've watched this through without actually starting to paint it, you can find the traceable up over on Patreon to help you with all of that. And if you are a supporter over on Patreon, thank you for making all this happen. These longer videos happen because of your support. I wouldn't have the time to make them otherwise, and this is because of you. This is for you, so thank you. I will see you very soon with a brand new hour-long painting lesson, and we'll end this with the important tagline that is, above all, as always, stay creative.